The schoolmen were so sensible of the force of this argument, that some of them maintained, that nature has mixed among those particles of matter, which are divisible in infinitum, a number of mathematical points, in order to give a termination to bodies; and others eluded the force of this reasoning by a heap of unintelligible cavils and distinctions. Both these adversaries equally yield the victory. A man, who hides himself, confesses as evidently the superiority of his enemy as another who fairly delivers his arms. Thus it appears that the definitions of mathematics destroy the pretended demonstrations, and that if we have the idea of indivisible points, lines, and surfaces conformable to the definition, their existence is certainly possible. But if we have no such idea, it is impossible we can ever conceive the termination of any figure, without which conception there can be no geometrical demonstration. But I go farther, and maintain that none of these demonstrations can have sufficient weight to establish such a principle as this of infinite divisibility, and that because with regard to such minute objects they are not properly demonstrations, being built on ideas which are not exact, and maxims which are not precisely true. When geometry decides anything concerning the proportions of quantity, we ought not to look for the utmost precision and exactness. None of its proofs extends so far. It takes the dimensions and proportions of figures justly, but roughly, and with some liberty. Its errors are never considerable, nor would it err at all, did it not aspire to such an absolute perfection. I first ask mathematicians what they mean when they say one line or surface is equal to, or greater, or less than another. Let any of them give an answer to whatever sect he belongs, and whether he maintains the composition of extension by indivisible points, or by quantities divisible in infinitum. This question will embarrass both of them. There are few or no mathematicians who defend the hypothesis of indivisible points, and yet these have the readiest and justest answer to the present question. They need only reply, that lines or surfaces are equal when the numbers of points in each are equal, and that as the proportion of the numbers varies, the proportion of the lines and surfaces is also varied. But though this answer be just as well as obvious, yet I may affirm that this standard of equality is entirely useless, and that it never is from such a comparison we determine objects to be equal or unequal with respect to each other. For as the points which enter into the composition of any line or surface, whether perceived by the sight or touch, are so minute and so confounded with each other, that it is utterly impossible for the mind to compute their number, such a computation will never afford us a standard by which we may judge of proportions. No one will ever be able to determine by an exact numeration, that an inch has fewer points than a foot, or a foot fewer than an ell, or any greater measure; for which reason we seldom or never consider this as the standard of equality or inequality. As to those who imagine that extension is divisible in infinitum, it is impossible they can make use of this answer, or fix the equality of any line or surface by a numeration of its component parts. For since, according to their hypothesis, the least as well as greatest figures contain an infinite number of parts, and since infinite numbers, properly speaking, can neither be equal nor unequal with respect to each other, the equality or inequality of any portions of space can never depend on any proportion in the number of their parts. It is true, it may be said, that the inequality of an ell and a yard consists in the different numbers of the feet of which they are composed, and that of a foot and a yard in the number of the inches. But as that quantity we call an inch in the one is supposed equal to what we call an inch in the other, and as it is impossible for the mind to find this equality by proceeding in infinitum with these references to inferior quantities, it is evident that at last we must fix some standard of equality different from an enumeration of the parts. There are some, see Dr. Barrow's Mathematical Lectures, who pretend that equality is best defined by congruity, and that any two figures are equal when upon the placing of one upon the other all their parts correspond to and touch each other. In order to judge of this definition, let us consider that since equality is a relation, it is not, strictly speaking, a property in the figures themselves, but arises merely from the comparison which the mind makes betwixt them. If it consists therefore in this imaginary application and mutual contact of parts, we must at least have a distinct notion of these parts, and must conceive their contact. Now it is plain that in this conception we would run up these parts to the greatest minuteness which can possibly be conceived, since the contact of large parts would never render the figures equal. But the minutest parts we can conceive are mathematical points, and consequently this standard of equality is the same with that derived from the equality of the number of points, which we have already determined to be a just, but an useless standard. We must therefore look to some other quarter for a solution of the present difficulty. There are many philosophers who refuse to assign any standard of equality, but assert that it is sufficient to present two objects that are equal, in order to give us a just notion of this proportion. All definitions, say they, are fruitless without the perception of such objects, and where we perceive such objects we no longer stand in need of any definition. To this reasoning I entirely agree, and assert that the only useful notion of equality or inequality is derived from the whole united appearance and the comparison of particular objects. It is evident that the eye, or rather the mind, is often able at one view to determine the proportions of bodies and pronounce them equal to, or greater, or less than each other, without examining or comparing the number of their minute parts. Such judgments are not only common, but in many cases certain and infallible. When the measure of a yard and that of a foot are presented, the mind can no more question that the first is longer than the second, than it can doubt of those principles which are the most clear and self-evident. There are therefore three proportions, which the mind distinguishes in the general appearance of its objects, and calls by the names of greater, less, and equal. But though its decisions concerning these proportions be sometimes infallible, they are not always so, nor are our judgments of this kind more exempt from doubt and error than those on any other subject. We frequently correct our first opinion by a review and reflection, and pronounce those objects to be equal, which at first we esteemed unequal, and regard an object as less, though before it appeared greater than another. Nor is this the only correction which these judgments of our senses undergo, but we often discover our error by a juxtaposition of the objects, or, where that is impracticable, by the use of some common and invariable measure, which, being successively applied to each, informs us of their different proportions. And even this correction is susceptible of a new correction, and of different degrees of exactness, according to the nature of the instrument by which we measure the bodies, and the care which we employ in the comparison. When, therefore, the mind is accustomed to these judgments and their corrections, and finds that the same proportion which makes two figures have in the eye that appearance which we call equality, makes them also correspond to each other, and to any common measure with which they are compared, we form a mixed notion of equality, derived both from the looser and stricter methods of comparison. But we are not content with this; for as sound reason convinces us that there are bodies vastly more minute than those which appear to the senses, and as a false reason would persuade us that there are bodies infinitely more minute, we clearly perceive that we are not possessed of any instrument or art of measuring, which can secure us from all error and uncertainty. We are sensible, that the addition or removal of one of these minute parts is not discernible either in the appearance or measuring; and as we imagine that two figures, which were equal before, cannot be equal after this removal or addition, we therefore suppose some imaginary standard of equality, by which the appearances and measuring are exactly corrected, and the figures reduced entirely to that proportion. This standard is plainly imaginary; for as the very idea of equality is that of such a particular appearance corrected by juxtaposition or a common measure, the notion of any correction beyond what we have instruments and art to make is a mere fiction of the mind, and useless as well as incomprehensible. But though this standard be only imaginary, the fiction, however, is very natural; nor is anything more usual than for the mind to proceed after this manner with any action, even after the reason has ceased which first determined it to begin. This appears very conspicuously with regard to time, where though it is evident we have no exact method of determining the proportions of parts, not even so exact as in extension, yet the various corrections of our measures and their different degrees of exactness have given us an obscure and implicit notion of a perfect and entire equality. The case is the same in many other subjects. A musician, finding his ear becoming every day more delicate, and correcting himself by reflection and attention, proceeds with the same act of the mind, even when the subject fails him, and entertains a notion of a complete tierce or octave, without being able to tell whence he derives his standard. A painter forms the same fiction with regard to colours; a mechanic with regard to motion. To the one light and shade, to the other swift and slow, are imagined to be capable of an exact comparison and equality beyond the judgments of the senses. We may apply the same reasoning to curve and right lines. Nothing is more apparent to the senses than the distinction betwixt a curve and a right line, nor are there any ideas we more easily form than the ideas of these objects. But however easily we may form these ideas, it is impossible to produce any definition of them, which will fix the precise boundaries betwixt them. When we draw lines upon paper, or any continued surface, there is a certain order by which the lines run along from one point to another, that they may produce the entire impression of a curve or right line. But this order is perfectly unknown, and nothing is observed but the united appearance. Thus, even upon the system of indivisible points, we can only form a distant notion of some unknown standard to these objects.